panel is climate change, the planet, and possible solutions. I know there was a lot of change in the last moment for this panel. Max, please, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Thanks so much, Carl, and pleasure to be here. So my name is Max. I'm the founder and CEO of Carbon Base. And over the last 2 years, we've been working very actively in applying technology, data science, and digital assets to the climate change problem. We are very lucky to work with some of the larger Asian clients out here in Hong Kong, Greater China. And we also have global collaboration with the WWF to actually pioneer the use case of impact NFTs. NFTs that actually capture, store, and transmit information about social impact around the world. One sort of exciting thing that I think we're investigating in is the wonderful analogous metaphor between the idea of a carbon credit, proof of work, and also the crypto ecosystem. So similar to how there's a Bitcoin mining protocol, which incentivizes a lot of people everywhere to care about the price of Bitcoin, but also to produce the hash power needed to power the Bitcoin network. We think there's an opportunity to build a carbon protocol that can incentivize people around the world to actually find ways to reduce CO2, actually save our world from climate change.
Okay, this is really interesting. So one obvious question which we ask, you make carbon credits and you put it on the blockchain, and a lot of people would say the blockchain technology uses a lot of energy to produce Bitcoins and so on. Is to put carbon credit on the blockchain not somehow productive?
Exactly. And so, sorry, a brief comment. I think Peter Prengemann also has arrived in the attendees, so we might need to promote him. He sent a message saying that as Felicia Fonseca, that he actually is Peter. So we can maybe find a way to pull him up. And then while we're doing this, I also give a mention to this. So indeed, there's a lot of exciting opportunities to actually use tokens to represent things that were not previously easily represented. So this idea of tokenized equity, tokenized securities, and now tokenized carbon credits. And to me, what really the opportunity of tokenized carbon credits represent is the ability to embed the idea of carbon awareness and carbon calculation into everyday life. Because if you have a way to actually record the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the car you drive, you actually have a way to embed carbon into those daily decisions at like a kilogram level or even at a gram level, then you actually make carbon credits a lot more accessible and interesting to everyone. As opposed to today, there's just a very small set of people who actually care about their own personal carbon footprint. The majority of people we don't actually know what our footprint is, and henceforth we don't have a way to reduce that footprint. I'll just continue talking while Carl's sort of getting our other panelists online. So what we found in our study of this is actually the carbon markets actually have a previous history of this activity. So up until 2005, there was no such concept of a carbon credit. So people who are emitting CO2 actually were not actively incentivized to care or actually track their CO2 emissions. But since 1990s, we actually have known that carbon credits actually is quite a negative thing for the environment. Sorry, carbon emissions are a negative thing for the environment. So based on this history, we now have created an idea of a carbon credit as a way to actually financially represent using, sort of the idea of a credit, an instrument that can be traded, captured, stored, and monetized. And this has given rise to many companies around the world who actually make a living off of producing negative emission carbon. And today, the carbon credit market is less than $2 or $3 billion. There's been a prediction by Fred Wilson, the founder of Union Square Ventures, who invests in Coinbase, Twitter, and so on. He says that he thinks that the carbon markets will 10x this year based on the interaction between the crypto world and the carbon credit world. And this is coming out of the mouth of a very accomplished sort of futurist. So I think that this year, 2022, is going to be a very pivotal and exciting year for this industry. Now back to you, Carl. Carl, I think you're on mute.
Okay, thank you very much. Just for reason, everyone should be able right now, as a co-hosts, they should be able to switch on the microphone and videos. Could you please test it?
I'm here.
Okay, thanks. Okay, can you so
Is Peter on?
where's Peter? Peter, we lost.
I think we lost Peter.
Okay, can you go off again? Sorry, what is going on here? You're on. Can you? Where are they? Participants.
I do have a question in the meantime, if you don't mind, actually, Max. So why not use a tax credit instead for companies specifically, rather than, a coin? Because as Carl mentioned earlier, a coin does also impact the carbon emission, right?
It's a great question. So as of today, the Bitcoin, Ethereum coins actually have a pretty negative carbon footprint. And so one of our sort of projects actually is we look at this footprint and we actually help anyone doing coins to actually first reduce their own footprint on the coin, and then whatever the coin's impact is supposed to be. But I think looking to the slight future, most of the other blockchains are going to be relatively carbon efficient. The transition to Ethereum is going to move from proof of work, where they have a lot of hashing power, to proof of stake, is going to make Ethereum 99.7% more carbon efficient, which is a dramatic increase or decrease in emissions. And then in reverse to tax, I think tax and actually this thing is it's kind of a very intricate interplay. But the cool thing about credits is that it actually gives a financial reward to people who are doing good, as well as penalizing the people doing bad. But in taxes, essentially people just get penalized more or less bad, right? So there's not as much sort of positive energy. And we actually had some really sort of late night chats at the United Nations climate change conference with some of the guys designing these markets. They were sort of wrestling with this idea that should we actually implement a tax or a carbon market? It's a really good question. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's interesting. So your company, how was it received till now worldwide by different governments? Can you please emphasize on this?
Yeah, so when we first started this, we actually started in January 2020. I came back from Davos, Switzerland, and I was driven by all the energy of climate change, the UN Climate Change Conference and Davos to basically start this. And 2020 January was a terrible time to start a company. Everyone was sort of worried about their personal survival and also survival of their companies. So the first year was very slow going. In September 2020, President Xi of China declared a carbon neutrality goal for the country. And keep in mind, China today represents 27% of the entire world's carbon emissions. Europe represents about 6%, and US represents 11%. So China as a country declared carbon neutrality goals, and instead of a domino effect, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore immediately followed after, and we're trying to outdo each other in terms of dates. Since then, we've seen a lot more sort of dynamism and actually in the desire for people to participate. And we've signed some pretty large deals. We actually signed the world's largest largest green hydro producer, the Three Gorges, as a client this year. They produce 100 billion kilowatt hours of green electricity. And we also signed some very large shipping companies that were the first shipping company to go carbon neutral in Hong Kong. And also we're working with the largest shopping mall in Japan and the largest transportation company in East Asia. So we've seen sort of a very vertical growth in our sort of ability to access and interact with the market. We also recently shot a small documentary for one of the local TV stations where they wanted to figure out what does a person need to do to actually live a low carbon life in a city. And so we sort of had a film crew go through and look at these sort of different choices people can make.
Peter, I know that you're on. I would like just to see, can you please?
I'm here, Carl. I think I've got the technical
okay.
thing figured out. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry,
Thank you.
guys.
Your video is not on yet.
You have to allow it. It says that you cannot start your video because the host has disabled it.
1 second. You should be. Can you please introduce yourself? So I'm looking at the video.
Yeah, I can do that. My name is Peter Prengelman. Really nice.
Peter?
I think we lost him. Oh, he's back.
Okay, here we go. Now, can you guys see me?
One sec. Okay. Now we should be able to see you. Peter?
I'm here. There we go.
Yeah,
Woo, woo, I'm here.
Great.
Hello, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here with you guys. I'm Peter Prengelman. I'm the AP's Climate and Environmental Global Editor. I've been with AP about 20 years and have worked all over the world in different roles. Climate change and environmental biodiversity, things like that have been a real kind of thread through my career, which brought me to this position.
Thank you very much. So you had the chances to listen to the blockchain and to carbon credits. What is your opinion to solve these problems? And do you know, as journalist, and you have exposure to all the new technologies, do you see alternative technologies? And please speak about alternative technologies which you saw as a journalist right now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, just to comment a little bit about what Max was saying, I think there's some really interesting innovations happening in the intersection between carbon credits and, say, blockchain, right? Neither of these things are new. They've been around for a long time, particularly carbon credits or carbon offsets. But the intersection is interesting because you have a chance, particularly some companies are working at trying to solve one big problem with carbon offsets, and that is double counting, right? You have a company or a country in one place that is going to pay to offset some of its carbon by hiring somebody in another place, another country, to, say, plant trees or whatever the project is. And then when it's all said and done, often both the person who commissioned the offset and the company or the country that paid for it count that as reducing carbon, which just problematic on lots of levels. So I think one of the things that blockchain can solve with this is there are some companies working to basically retire that ton of carbon as soon as it's commissioned. There's a registry of it, of course, is blockchain, so you know who does what, but it just gets retired, immediately. So I think that's one thing that's a real innovation. And just to keep with kind of the theme of this, we're talking about innovation in companies and crypto and blockchain. I think that there's some interesting things happening because companies that work in cryptocurrencies are criticized quite a bit from people on the left and environmentalists because of the enormous amount of energy that they take to mine. But what you see is that some of these companies are really moving toward a portfolio of energy that's really varied. So you have, maybe 20%, 30% solar, or sometimes wind that is helping power the mining. And if you look at those portfolios, it's more than a lot of companies have of like green energy. So, on one hand, they face a lot of criticism because of the enormous energy. On the other hand, some of these companies are really at the forefront of diversifying portfolios of energy. So I think that's another kind of interesting change. I don't know how much more you want me to talk about different innovations and things that I see around climate in general.
If I can just add on to what Peter just said, I think that there is a sort of critical transition point, especially for Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is the world's largest consumer of energy by a decade, a milestone for any of the cryptocurrencies. It actually is about the size of Pakistan or Norway right now as a country. And there was a recent China ban where there was a Nature paper published in China saying that the Bitcoin mining as an industry was going to derail China's ability to reach carbon neutrality. And a few days after this paper came out, there was an immediate sort of a tourniquet saying this is no more an industry that we support. Everyone's got to, get out of here ASAP, or otherwise we confiscate your stuff. And we saw a huge decrease in mining production as all the machines were then shifted overseas, and most of them have ended up in the United States. But at the same time, what's happening now is that there's an interest on institutional front to adopt crypto that we've never seen before. Goldman and JP Morgan and all these guys are really trying to become part of this institutional crypto wave, and they are unable to participate because of the ESG shackles on their LPs, on their limited partners. So this interplay for me is basically creating a catalyst for the people who actually operate the Bitcoin mines and operate this stuff, as Peter was saying, to be intensely conscious of where the energy comes from, and as much as possible to actually find opportunities to use green energy, so they can actually overcome some of the customer hurdles that they have. And I believe that this could eventually lead to a situation where the entire Bitcoin network becomes carbon neutral before the traditional finance sector does. And that's kind of an interesting compare and contrast when we look at energy footprint in this matter.
Thank you, Max. Peter, one question. We see a lot of funds coming up, and they say we invest in ecological companies which are conscious and so on. And then we see that all these funds invest in the wrong companies, and that basically it's just smoke in the mirrors. What would you think has to change that the financial companies really see which companies are good, what they should look at?
I think it's a good question. One of the most interesting things I think with ESGs in general right now is the question of how you evaluate them, right? Because companies put in their filings all kinds of stuff, and you have a combination, right? I mean, you have companies that really are greenwashing, and as one analyst who works in this told me, they get excited because they planted some trees and they want the world to know they planted some trees, but at the same time, a lot of their practices have cut forests. At the same time, there are companies that really are trying to change what they do, and move towards more renewable energies, move towards just a smaller environmental footprint of what they're doing. So to your question, how do you know if you're a company, what you invest in, and how you make the right choice? I think a lot of it comes down to what the companies are claiming and the accountability around those claims. And so I think one of the more interesting discussions in this area is how you monitor these and how you evaluate them. Do you create laws, as some countries are starting to do, where you might find a company that lies, where you might move towards shutting them down, or maybe redirect in a better way, or call them out. So how do you do this, and how do you regulate them? Because you can claim anything, and I know from a journalism standpoint, to even look at one company and say, here's what they claimed, here's what actually happened, here's what they said, it takes an enormous amount of resources. So I think that question really has to be solved. Of ESGs are great, companies moving toward more sustainable development is great, but how do we check them on that? How do we make sure? How do we combine what they said with what they've actually done?
Thank you very much. This is interesting and really right. The question is, when many investors are still old school and think that basically ecologically friendly investment is not really the most profitable investments because of the ESGs and the backlashes which we had right now. From a journalistic point of view, you see the public reactions, how are the articles read, which are more fostering companies which are ecological friendly versus the other one? Do you see there is a broad support from the public opinion
for more ecological thinking in the companies? And
yes,
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of surveys and polls show that increasingly climate change, environmental protections are a bigger and bigger part of what people are thinking about. It depends on who you are in life, what you're able to think about. If you are somebody in a developing country and you're fighting to survive, you have more like immediate concerns in front of you. But it doesn't mean you're not concerned about the environment. If you're, a business and you're making a lot of money and you're seeing that things are moving towards, more environmentalism, then you have incentives to move in that direction too. But I think public opinion is pretty clear. Every country's different, every demographic's different, but there is increasing awareness, I think increasing interest in climate change and in staving off, I think, the worst effects. And we're feeling the effects, right? We're feeling the impacts of climate change. Sometimes in small ways, if you're in the United States and you cancel your yearly vacation to, I don't know, parks to go camping because the smoke is so bad from longstanding wildfires, which are, pushed in large part by climate change or not fueled by climate change, but climate change makes them worse. Climate change is affecting you. If you live in a small village in a developing country and your village has been wiped out several times, or the crops where you have been working for centuries, your family no longer grow because of erosion, because of climate change, you're being impacted by climate change. So we're seeing a lot of these impacts, and I think that makes people more conscious of what's going on and more interested.
May I ask a follow-up question?
1 second, we have 2 minutes. One question which was really important is we have a lot of people denying climate change. We have a lot of people saying that we are still on basically in an ice age. Both polar caps are still frozen, and warm age is defined when non-polar cap has any more ice. And they claim that the sun is more powerful with sunspots to bring us in ice ages and not, and this is a normal cycle, and basically it has not so much to do with us. Can both of you just for a moment give a 1 minute answer, quick, what you would say to this opinion from different peoples?
I'll jump in on that. I would say everybody's entitled to their opinion, but the science is increasingly clear, and I think has been for a long time, that CO2, other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere warm the planet. I don't think there's any scientific doubt about that. Where there is a lot of I think conflicts are what you do about it, and that's that's what we're here to do. We're here to debate. But I would say just to sum that up, even in the United States, where we'll say traditionally Republicans have been more climate change deniers, it's not really fashionable. You can't be an outward denier anymore. Not really. You may not use the words climate change. You may tackle different issues related to climate change by calling them different things, like, I don't know, drain mitigation or redoing the drain system because of storms and flooding. You may not call it climate change, but you're moving towards climate change. So yeah, I sum up mine by saying that.
Okay, thank you very much.
I was watching the Don't Look Up a few days ago, and I think Netflix just said it's the second most ever popular watch show on Netflix, and I think the show is about asteroids, but I think it's really about climate change and the fact that we're sort of losing our ability to react to the important things because the short-term news cycle is really just eating into our brains. And I would say, in some ways, the tools that got us here, the ability actually to infect, 7 billion people's consciousness through social media, has to be the tools we get out of this. We need to have a process where we go to the largest social media platforms and say, you need to, over a course of 2 years, run a campaign on climate education. And you need to do the most, use the viral tools you have available to sort of make it exciting and interesting as opposed to boring and sort of stuff. That is an essential part of how we're going to do this. And I think we have totally within the power. This, essentially, the countries have committed to the Paris Agreement. Now we need to get the companies in the countries to just get on the program. And so that's really something I hope we can do more of.
Okay, my follow-up question is a little bit complicated on the disconnect. So if you guys get everybody to get on board with this, but you still have these traditional investment funds investing in commodities such as gold, such as oil, and the new funds that are coming up everywhere are not tried and true. How do you convince investors to go down in the ability to make their money per year?
This is a great question. This is, I think, in many ways, the reason we're where we are in the world with carbon. How do you tackle this? I think one company and one story at a time. I think the more, and this is the role of journalism, that we can show people the impacts of climate change, that we can show people the innovators of climate change and trying to mitigate things, that we can show people different policies that help change some of these things. I think you're going to move people a little bit socially, like a consciousness. But you're also creating a whole world of viewers, readers who have expectations that companies don't just make decisions based on their bottom line, because their bottom line, in many cases these days, still really depends on fossil fuels. And we haven't talked about it, but mining. I mean, you mentioned mining, right? Like electric vehicles, so many things that we say are going to help us change the situation with climate. Take lithium, take other minerals, and it takes incredible mining that also have environmental problems. So there are no easy solutions, but I think it's a level of consciousness and calling companies out, calling countries out, keep holding them to account. And then, like Max said, I like this this idea. I mean, we'd have to think about it a little bit more because it'd be pretty polemical, but really kind of trying to get the world to understand more of what is going on. Without taking necessarily opinions of this we should do or that, but just people to understand the science.
I want to build on this, and something we're working on right now. This is a live project. Is we're actually trying to change the way that companies and countries monetize natural resources. So the key thing is, up to now, the only way to monetize trees, oil, or gold is basically to dig it out of the ground or chop it off and then sell it to someone else. That's the only way that we can monetize. So the countries that have a natural resource ends up with a resource curse because they're actually forced into the exploitative economy in order to actually monetize. We're trying to work with a particular company in Greenland actually to pioneer the idea of non-production, where there's a bunch of oil in Greenland. Greenland as a country has basically banned all future exploration of oil last year. And so there's one company left with one license, and they have to decide if they want to drill or not. And they came to us and we sort of discussed this in detail and said, okay, we're going to proactively decide not to drill, but instead we're going to calculate the carbon content of the oil that we're leaving in the ground, which can end up between somewhere, tens of millions to close to like 1 billion tons of CO2. And we're going to actually try to request other participants to use this as a source of negative carbon emission. If we manage to succeed in this endeavor, we can actually create a model where non-production becomes a monetary process. And that actually makes the countries with these natural resources far more interested in preservation because they can actually monetize it directly. And there's a crazy idea behind this, which actually came out in the science fiction book last year called Ministry for the Future. And it was written by the guy who who wrote the Green, Red, and Blue Mars series. And so instead of looking at the future planetary and geology of Mars, he decided to focus attention on Earth. He was like, oh man, we're screwed. Climate change is at our doorstep. So his key idea, which I think Carl might have seen in literature, is the idea of carbon quantitative easing. which is that the central banks of the world actually produce money, but the only way to earn this money is through carbon. So instead of, right now we just did QE in the US, like $5 trillion went to the stock markets. Everyone who owns stocks were really happy and everyone else is still relatively pretty, not well off. Like in this new CQE world, carbon quantitative easing, the money created by the central banks can only be earned by reducing CO2. And so you can become a billionaire if you find a way to industrialize CO2 removal, and that actually can change the way that economies sort of operate in the future.
Thank you. My question is, when you both look at climate change, is the way a hybrid or one or the other from the following things? A lot of people say we have to restrict our lifestyle, we have to change our lifestyle to be more conscious. Other people bet on new developments, new technologies, which will basically help us to develop us out and make our technology more friendly. So climate friendly. Is it for you more the solution in everyone should start to be more conscious by its purchasing behavior, or is the solution more in the development of new technologies to solve the problems? Please, Max, start. You're already there.
I think that's one of the unique things about human society is that we've always found ways to meet the sort of seemingly unmeetable challenges once become like present. This is a thing. So I was reminded of a quote that said that in the old days, London, they sort of said, okay, we have horse buggies pulling around people. If we scale to the number of people that can horse buggy serves people, we'll be in two meters of horse poop, right? And then we had automobiles and we sort of changed the way we transport. So I think that we're at this sort of social conscious sinking level now, where everyone realizes that we have a problem, right? And now the question is actually, how do we sort of change this? And I think what we need to do is three things simultaneously. We need to have individuals be incentivized to do behavioral change on a consumption level. And we're starting to see this happen at the young generations. Anyone under the age of 30, they care a lot more about climate change than the people that did last generation, because this is now at their doorstep. And they're starting to change the way they consume, the way they shop, and so on. Second thing is, I think that large companies that are actually emitting CO2, they need to face existential risk of survival. And some of them already do. BP is, I think, really tangling with this in a big way, because if those companies stay around and fight the change, then they're going to slow us down dramatically. And so they need to sort of get on the program, or they need to be pushed off, and investors need to sort of do something to them. And then the final thing is, I think at a government level, we need to start setting new economic principle rules, where the free market as a concept is a beautiful concept, makes things super efficient. The free market as of today, the rules governing the free market do not adequately capture the social cost of shared demise. And so we need to find ways to price this into this market economy, using tools like carbon credits, using tools like biodiversity credits, or non-production, and actually have that become part of the societal fabric. Over to Peter.
I agree with a lot of what Max said. Carl, I want to take your question in those two things, right? Like personal responsibility and technology. What you hear when you talk about doing things just on a personal level is people say, well, what does it matter, right? I'm just one person. I can't really make that much change. Like, okay, maybe I'll ride my bike and not, to get in my car or whatever, come up with any kind of number of things. And then on the technology side, a lot of people who really don't want to confront climate change will say, technology is going to take care of it, right? We're gonna figure out this new way and that new way. I think the thinking for both of those lines of thought is actually wrong, because it's only part of the solution, right? A part of the solution is being conscious, making different choices. I think is to the extent that you can. I think part of the solution particularly is technology and figuring out how things can be done better and more efficiently. Another big piece of it, though, is also policy. And I think about this one example, like I grew up in Oregon. My grandparents lived in Los Angeles. We'd always go to Los Angeles 2 or 3 times a year. And I remember the smog. It was just horrible in the 70s and the 80s. And I've been doing a lot of research about that, about how did that change? Because years later, between 2005 and 2008, I lived in Los Angeles and there was smog, but it wasn't anywhere near what I used to see. And the conclusion I came to was like the importance of the Clean Air Act, right? Which I believe, if memory serves, was 1970, that really forced some policy changes that forced better emissions that led to a better outcome. So I think the solution, there's no one solution, it's many solutions. It's personal, it's technology, it's policy. And it's also one thing that Max said was that trying to put a price on carbon, I think is really important. This has not been done historically. Like a company's, their ledger was like how much we spent, how much we made, without like any real consideration of the cost of that carbon going into the atmosphere.
Carl, you're on mute.
Carl, you still there?
Okay, I want to say thank you. I totally agree. And during the pandemic, the one nice thing is that it was possible for us to see from here, the Catalina Island, up to the mountains without any smoke and clean. It changes really when we are more careful. We have Stan here also on the line. I just want to ask Stan, can you please introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, how are you? So my name is Stan Stoniker. I'm the founder of Hub Culture. We have generally for about 15 years now a big presence in Davos. So if those of you who've been to Davos, you may have been to the Hub and the Ice House and the Tech Lodge. We operate a digital currency called VEN, which is the world's oldest digital currency, and it's backed by carbon because as an organization and a community, the focus of climate and climate change has been pretty central to our existence for many years. And, we've been at many of the COPs going back to 2009 in Copenhagen. So we've been able to host a lot of conversations over the years around climate and circular economy. And so this is something that I think is very close to the center of what we think about as an organization. And I think that, it was very interesting, the Ministry of the Future comments that Max just said earlier, because I've actually been told by a couple of people to read the book, but I didn't realize what it was exactly about until you just explained it. So I'm literally going to order that today and get into it. I'd love to talk today about something new that we've been working on, which I think is really interesting. And unfortunately, it's a little bit scary, but it's actually part of the conversation that we think is going to be emerging over the next 3 to 5 years. And it's actually about oxygen. And we have spent the last year, really from about this time last year, diving into the world of oxygen and the idea of deoxygenization for the planet. And the idea of oxygen and carbon very much go hand in hand in the climate conversation. And we think that in a way, oxygen is the missing link in thinking about holistic climate solutions. So first of all, I'd love to hit you guys with a few facts about oxygen. The reality is that we have, we think, thousands of years of oxygen on the planet. Like, we don't really think of oxygen as being a problem the way that carbon is a problem. Carbon exists in about like 0.002% of the atmosphere and is growing. We just passed 350 parts per million about 10 years ago, and we're now approaching 400 parts per million for carbon in the atmosphere, which was going to be a problem, and it really is a problem. And the biggest problem with that much carbon in the atmosphere is that puts us on a pathway to runaway climate change. Not just 1.5 degrees, which is the UNFCCC's target, but really looking at maybe 3 degrees and above, which is pretty catastrophic. And we can talk about the consequences of that. On the other side of that, though, about 20% of the oxygen, or of the atmosphere, is oxygen. The atmosphere is made up of like 50% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, and then other things like hydrogen. And then very small parts are linked to carbon. Where it gets very interesting is understanding how oxygen is produced and circulated on the planet. Right now, and we don't really know the exact numbers, but the latest research has shown that about 80% of the oxygen that's produced on the planet comes from the oceans. And that's pretty interesting, because that production pipeline is being shut down right now. And this is actually potentially a very, very big problem for us. On land, the other 20% comes from trees and forests. And as we know, to a large extent, trees and forests, especially old growth trees, are being destroyed. And old growth trees produce more oxygen than new growth. So even though the actual total amount of tree cover in the last like 30 years has grown somewhat on the planet, the reality is that we're losing oxygen from trees and forests. And then the final piece of this is us humans and urban areas. As the planet warms and as urban areas, which we occupy, warm, we're transforming O2, oxygen, into O3, which is ozone. And this is from essentially just heating the planet by a couple of degrees. So the picture that's emerging for the longer run is that because we're changing the way that oxygen is produced on the planet because of the Anthropocene and through the production of carbon, we're actually beginning to shut down the oxygen supply for the planet. And some of the most recent projections on this show that we actually may be approaching an oxygen issue within like 600 years. And that's a very big difference from where we're at now and where we think we are in terms of oxygen. But it's also an extinction level event for life on the planet. Climate change is an adaptation level event for life on the planet. It's very scary. Even 3 to 4 degrees is survivable. We would have to move to essentially the Arctic and to very like extreme weather zones, because temperate zones between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn would become, in some cases, uninhabitable. Like, for instance, the US would completely desertify in a 3 to 4 degree scenario, and oceans would rise by 15 to 20 feet, which would inundate most of our coastal cities. And that could happen within 100 to 150 years. But the oxygen issue over the next 600 years is an extinction level event. So coming back quickly to the oceans, the reason 80% of the oceans, or the 80% of the oxygen comes from oceans is because of phytoplankton. So what happens is across the planet, sunlight hits the oceans, it turns phytoplankton, it hits phytoplankton, the phytoplankton process that sunlight and they output oxygen. And what's happening is that carbon, which is sort of what we generally talk about and what Max was just talking about, carbon produced by us, well, actually, maybe not 80, I think it's actually about 60% of the carbon that we are producing right now from cars and vehicles and coal plants is being pumped into the air, and it's being absorbed by the oceans. And so the oceans have been the balancer that have let us pump as much carbon as we have for the last 200 years into the atmosphere. But the result of that is that the carbon being absorbed by the oceans is sequestering, but it's changing the pH balance of the oceans. And this is something that we call ocean acidification. Right now, the pH balance of the oceans is dropping from an average of 9.5 across the planet to around 8.0. The problem is that this is enough to make the oceans too acidic for phytoplankton to exist. And so we're starting now to see, just in the last 10 years, the first massive die-offs of plankton. And so when phytoplankton dies, not only does it stop producing oxygen in the ocean, you start to get dead zones. So these hypoxic zones in the ocean. Currently, there's one stretching hundreds of miles off the coast of Oregon. We occasionally have them in the Gulf of Mexico, and we don't even really calculate them in other places, like maybe off the coast of China, in the South China Sea, where you have more pollution runoff and other like pollutants in the water. So this is a very, very big issue, and it's something that we haven't even really started looking at, let alone starting to address. And unfortunately, you know, I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but it's a little bit of a lagging system. Right now, the sequestration levels for pH balances in the oceans are lagging by at least 20 years in terms of the effects that we're seeing. And so even if we were to fully shut off carbon going into the atmosphere today, the odds are that we wouldn't see increasing acidification and deoxygenization of the oceans. It's basically impossible. So in my mind, the only solution that we have to do is to find rapid deceleration of carbon into the atmosphere and rapid acceleration of carbon sequestration from the atmosphere. But even then, we're still likely to, you know, shut down most of the oxygen production on the planet. If we can change the arc, we have enough oxygen in the atmosphere that it's not going to be an extinction level event for us. But if we keep going on the path that we are, climate change is not just an adaptation level event, it's an extinction level event. And that's the message that I really wanted to convey to you guys. We've spent the last year building a new token system that we're calling Van Oxygen. We just announced it at the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow. And we built a mapping system that's open source that allows anybody who owns trees and forests to be able to map and earn a new coin for protecting those trees and forests. And it's linked to the production of oxygen. So for every ton of oxygen produced by trees and forests, you can earn one of these coins. And we hope that over time, the value of that will grow. It's also, a final point, interesting that for every ton of oxygen produced on the planet, we could kind of think of that as like a derivative of carbon and equal to a ton of carbon sequestered, because a tree or plant breathes in molecules of carbon dioxide and it exhales oxygen, and that carbon dioxide is coming from the atmosphere. So there are some interesting correlations. And I think that what will emerge is some sort of accounting system for the atmosphere at large. It's something that we're working on, to look at a complete accounting system related to the atmosphere and to try to bring value so that we can measure and try to build better outcomes. But it's going to take a lot more than us to get to any solution on that. And finally, I'm in a rural area, and so I have a lot of chickens because it's very early in the morning. So I hope that the roosters have been a wonderful accompaniment to my diatribe today.
I was wondering about this, Dan. Okay, Peter, you're as a journalist and head of the press, what is your opinion? What did you just hear?
Pretty scary. I mean, this is a process, you know, that I'm aware of. I think we need to do more stories in this area. I've been taking some notes. I particularly want to look at the dead zone in Oregon and get a better sense of that. But one thing I wasn't clear on is a little bit more of the company, because you talk about taking carbon out of the atmosphere. I mean, is this a company that works with people who are doing, you know, carbon capture, different kinds of carbon capture, whether it's direct air capture or just I'd be interested a little bit more like that, because I think the general statement, we need to get some carbon out of the atmosphere, there aren't many people who disagree with that if you've really looked at this, but I just wasn't clear on that piece of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't say much about our company or what we do, but we are not a carbon sequestration or carbon capture company. Hub Culture is a social network. We're the oldest social network in the world, established in 2002. And we are very active in tokenization. So we own an exchange and a tokenization platform, and Van, a digital currency. We create spaces around the world that our members access and use. And one of those spaces every year is in Davos. And so we're very active in the Davos community. We also do spaces in like hubs, basically, at the UN FFFC and the UN General Assembly in September in New York. So we're really a community company and a social network company. It's established 20 years ago in 2002. And we were the first people to do digital currency, and we backed our digital currency with carbon because we were concerned about the climate issue, and we wanted to take the externality of carbon and move it into the DNA of the money that circulates through our community. And we really think of ourselves as like a prototype for a virtual state. So we're very active in metaverse. We're building our own metaverse for the last couple of years. And, you know, we kind of mix that idea of physical space and locations. We've done 60 locations. I'm right now at our location in Kauai, where we have a CEO retreat space, hence the chickens. And, you know, we're not active as a company in terms of creating carbon sequestration technologies. I wish we had that kind of technical capability, but we're active in terms of trying to promote and find solutions and folks that are doing it. There are 2 or 3 companies that are doing carbon sequestration and trying to do something they call DAC, which is direct air capture. It's a kind of smokestack, and the smokestack takes in air, it pumps in the air, and it filters the carbon out and creates a solid compound from the carbon. But the problem is you know, you mentioned, or you probably heard me say that 0.002% of the atmosphere is carbon. So if you think about how much air you have to process to be able to get a significant amount of carbon, just from the general air, it's literally like impossible at the moment. And what you have to do it is at the point of emission. So DAC technologies are best deployed on smokestacks, on factories like coal factories that are still in existence, things like that, where you can capture the carbon directly as it's coming out of the smokestack. Otherwise, the efficiencies and the percentages of carbon to air make it really, really difficult. Unfortunately, most of the carbon that's in the atmosphere is what we call fugitive carbon. It's, you know, one thing I would encourage you all to think about is the idea of how to define carbon. So fugitive carbon is carbon that has been, you know, if you're a Burning Man type, you would say it's like carbon out of place or matter out of place. It's carbon that is out of place, fugitive carbon. Any pollution is fugitive carbon. Durable carbon is carbon that we're sequestering or taking back, or like, you know, taking at point of source and then storing. So carbon capture, things like that. And then that can actually be turned into a solid good, carbon fiber, other materials that could be potentially economically viable or valuable. That's durable carbon. And so I encourage you to think about those types of carbon so that we can define. Carbon isn't the enemy. How we treat carbon and process carbon is the problem.
Just to give you all a heads up, we are 2 minutes out from our next panel. So if you guys want to close out a thought or two, that would be lovely. Why don't we start with Peter?
Real pleasure to be here. I think that when we think of 2022, there's some really big stories that we're going to be looking at. You know, the way that we use energy, the impacts of climate change on different people. The importance of policy. I think COP27 is going to be really important for a lot of different reasons. So I think, you know, little by little, there's a higher level of consciousness about this, and I think the real interesting thing comes, and this is what we do as journalists, is trying to facilitate and, you know, showcase that debate, because it's not our role to, you know, to take positions on anything one way or the other.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure. Max?
Stan, it's absolutely amazing. Thank you for sharing. I think that we need to prototype new country models. You know, hub culture seems to be a great place to do that. Let's use the country model pioneering to then, you know, change like central bank economies. Like, I'll message you about that. And then we
Absolutely.
need to use quantitative carbon financing to drive DAC. We just need to build like a bajillion DAC machines, like at scale, right? We spend like $3, $4, $5 trillion on this.
We can DAO it.
Yes, please.
Stan, you have the closing word.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. This is my 2022 message is about oxygen. Thank you for listening. I hope the facts are helpful, and it's wonderful that you guys organize Digital Davos. Such a pleasure. And we'll see you in June at the Hub.
Thank you all.